Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the first Professional Development Interest Group, PDIG, webinar of 2021. It also happens to be the first Cavall event of 2021, which is very exciting. Firstly, I ask that you mute yourselves and turn off your cameras if you haven't done so already. My name is Sarah Davidson, and I'm the Member Services Coordinator here at Cavall. I'm very pleased to introduce you to Adrian Gallagher, who will say a few words of welcome and introduction. Adrian is the Associate University Librarian, Learning Resources, Technology and Infrastructure at Victoria University. He's also Victoria University's representative to the PDIG committee. Thank you, Adrian.
On behalf of Cavall and the Professional Development Interest Group, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands across Australia and New Zealand where we live, learn and work. We acknowledge and celebrate the inherent strengths of Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander and other First Nation peoples, recognising their continuing connection to the land, waters, sky and culture. We also pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So welcome to the first webinar in this PDIG series, Steer Your Career. This is the first of 3 sessions exploring different aspects of career development, online networking, and transitioning to different work environments and sectors. As you're all undoubtedly aware, the tertiary library sector in Australia and New Zealand has experienced significant job losses and budget cuts throughout 2020-2021, raising uncertainty among many of those who are working in the industry. In order to help alleviate this uncertainty and hopefully empower the library staff to take ownership of their career and development, this webinar is going to focus on recruitment and practical tips about improving your CV. If you have any technical questions during the presentation, please type your question into the chat and the Cavall team will assist you. Also, please use the 2 hashtags, the hash PDIG Forum 221 and Steer Your Career when commenting on social media during or after the webinar. And Sarah's going to add those in the chat. This event's going to start with Jay Glazier, Senior Manager, Student and Community Outreach and Engagement at La Trobe University. She's sharing her experience of recruitment, particularly after having to recruit an entirely new team. Adele Walsh is the Senior Coordinator, Community Outreach and Engagement, also at La Trobe, and she'll be presenting some practical tips on how to keep your CV up to date. Adele and Jay will also answer any burning questions at the conclusion of the webinar. Now, if you have questions for the speaker throughout the session, please ask them through the Slido link, which we've also put into the chat, and it's also on the rotating slides. You can also go to slido.com or the Slido app, and there's an event code to use, which is hash 50473. And I think Sarah will also put that somewhere in the chat. So without further ado, I'll pass now on to Jay. Thanks.
Thanks, Adrian. Can everybody hear me? I guess I can't see you, so right, let me just share my screen. Can you all see that PowerPoint?
Perfect.
Yes.
A bit difficult to miss. Well, hello everyone, and it's great to be here. I see lots of old faces and names I know in the audience, so really lovely to see some of you again, and one day maybe in person. So thank you for the introduction, Adrian. Actually, I think I misinformed you because my job title now has changed. So while my team has doubled, my job title has halved, which is great because I had the longest job title in the library, I think. So I'm now Senior Manager Outreach and Engagement, which means terrifyingly, I have responsibility for proper librarians and proper librarian work. So I'm enjoying the challenge and very much enjoying learning more about librarianship as I go. So first of all, these are some of the topics that I'm going to attempt to cover in the very generous 20 minutes that I've been given. So how did I get here, i.e. why me? Some tips on preparing for interview, the value of networking, which of course is why we're all here and why we all enjoy Cavale so much. Some stuff about your personal brand, which you may or may not have thought about in the past. Feedback in both directions through the recruitment process. And assuming I don't run out of time, I'll also be talking about the perspective as a recruiter. So my credentials and why I'm here presenting to you. I've actually had, I worked it out horrifyingly, over 30 years in and around librarianship, so working in the industry. But only latterly, in the final part of my career, have I actually come to work in an actual library, and I'm really enjoying it. So I know heaps about library work, but I know very little about professional library skills. One thing I have done lots of in all of my jobs is both recruit and be recruited. So I guess I'm bringing my own personal perspective and just sharing some of the things that I've found useful or things that I have noticed when I've been on that recruitment journey. So as Adrian pointed out, one of the first things I had to do when I joined La Trobe, which was about a year and a half ago, was recruit my own team. La Trobe had just been through a change process, and I had over half the library in my section, but I had 4 empty positions that reported directly to me. So this was quite a daunting challenge, particularly as I was new to libraries, working in a library. And at first I thought this was actually going to disadvantage me, but I realized now that it was an excellent opportunity, not just because it gave me insights into La Trobe as an organisation and the culture and the strategic direction of the university and the library, but also it gave me the opportunity to handpick people that I thought would be great for the organisation and that would complement my own management style and leadership style. So one of the things I did plenty of when I started at La Trobe was interviewing. And we had a lot of staff as well that were not matched through this change process. And so we had heaps of internal staff applying for roles as well. So I learned a lot about what worked and what didn't work for people who were attending interviews. One of the things that I did before I joined La Trobe was I did a heap of research. I realised that my learning curve was quite steep, that going from working around and with libraries to working in a library would be quite a massive learning curve. So I did a lot of reading about La Trobe. I read their strategic plan, I read the library plan, I read all of the framework documents that were on the website. So anything that was publicly available, I read. And I also asked a lot of questions. So I had mentors at that point who were working in higher education libraries, and I talked to them about concepts that were quite new to me, like e-learning, academic outreach and engagement, these kinds of focuses that everybody in higher education has to really pay attention to. And when I went to interview, I realised I didn't have a great deal of experience to draw on from within libraries, but I had an awful lot of experience through my previous jobs. So I guess what I did was I collected the stories that I thought I could use, the content, the material I could use in an interview that could be pretty much repurposed to respond to almost any question that I might be asked. So having material and content and stories at your fingertips that you can tweak to respond to pretty much any question that you're asked is invaluable. So you don't have to scrabble around and think of examples. So you've got a wealth of material at your fingertips. Something else I think is really important is, particularly as you go through sort of along your career path, is to consider what you personally have to offer. So I was not typical academic librarian material. I knew that. I didn't have experience in academic libraries. I didn't have a professional qualification, but I knew I had a whole lot of other stuff that would be relevant and valid. and useful and complement their skills that were already in place in the library. So I think about yourself and your experience in that context. So what is it that you have that is different or that complements what already exists in the organisation? Don't underplay or undersell yourself, but think about your own unique experience and how that could be relevant. And I think the last piece of advice is to stay true to your brand. And I won't develop that theme at this point, but I'm coming to it later in a slide a little bit further on in the presentation. So we'll be able to touch on that. So the thing I thought about, and the thing I've always thought about when I apply for a job, is what kind of place is right for me? And I think this is really important, and we often forget to think about ourselves as having something to offer, something valuable to offer. So in a way, you're interviewing the organisation in the same way that the organisation is interviewing you. And it's really important to think about whether the values of that organisation match your own values, whether the culture is the kind of culture that you want to be part of. Get to know the people. And that is not as hard as it sounds. I think the sources of information that are publicly available are excellent, but you need to dig a little bit deeper and start talking to people who have worked at the organisation, who already work at the organisation, who used to work at the organisation, people that you know or that you have tenuous connections with, who can give you their own personal insights into what kind of place this is and what sort of reputation does it have. And again, there are public sources of information about reputation, particularly in higher education and library land. So I guess my call to action for this particular activity is do your research, do a lot of research, but do it both formally and informally by just talking to people, because that's where you learn the really good stuff. The power of networking. Can't really overemphasize the importance of this. And I think as a profession, we are tending towards introversion. We tend to be more introverted than extrovert. And some of us are shy, and some of us just find networking hard. And in fact, everybody finds networking hard. Everybody thinks they are the only one that finds it hard, but in fact, we all find it hard. It's like public speaking. So it's really about putting yourself slightly out of your comfort zone and talking to people at every opportunity. Social media, of course, I think we're all pretty good at social media in its different forms and on the different platforms. So that's certainly one way to network, but that's not the only way to network. And I think it's very often as you kind of get through your career path, it's who you know and it's what they know about you. And this is all part of developing your brand. So I guess there I'm saying, what is it that you're passionate about? And how do you pitch yourself on social media? And how do you present yourself to people when you're in a networking situation? I think I'd like to ask you just to do a little bit of an activity now. Think about somebody in library land that has a very high profile, a strong media presence, somebody that you know through Twitter, and just put the name of that person in the chat and then attach to that person's name a couple of the things that you think are important, that you know about them through their branding. And I can't see the chat at the moment, but I think it would be interesting for everybody to see what other people have said. Anybody got any ideas? Sarah, throw a few at me.
Yes, so Adele has been, she suggested Claire Thorpe, strategic,
Yep.
considered, knowledgeable.
Yep.
Andy Priestner, library layout and design.
Yep.
Oh, here we got one. Jay, approachable, strategic, and great fashion sense.
Oh, I like that one. All right, well, let's quit while we're ahead. Thank you. Was that you, Sarah?
No, it wasn't.
So I think what the point I'm making here is that it is really important that you present yourself in the right way. And that doesn't mean that you have to be always 100% professional. It does mean sometimes it's best not to talk about how you went out on the Terps last night and then pulled a sickie at work the next day, because that sort of information is available to employers and potential employers. So keep a close eye to what you're presenting in the public domain. But really personal branding, let me move on to the next slide, because this is about branding. So personal branding is, according to Dr. Google, is conscious and intentional effort to create and influence public perception of an individual by reputation, creating authority in a particular subject area, and it's a continuous process. And I just want to give a little anecdote here. I did check with my colleague Hugh before I did this, because you know, he's not here luckily, so he can't hear what I say about him. But when I first employed Hugh Rundle, he wasn't known to me at all except through social media. And I had already a very strong perception of the sort of person that he is. And then I employed him a second time at La Trobe, and his brand has continued to be strong through New Cardigan organisation and all of the sort of slightly nerdy work that he does in the industry. And I think with somebody like Hugh, you feel like you know him and you understand his values and you know what's important to him and what he's passionate about before you even meet the person. That sort of thing is quite important, I think. So the more you can be connected to an organisation and an industry and a sector in the right way, the better your chances are. Just going back to the interview process, another thing that I've found for myself to be very useful is often in a job ad, there'll be an opportunity to talk to somebody about the role. I would strongly recommend you always take that opportunity, because regardless of whether you need to know stuff or not, it's an opportunity already to flag yourself as a potential employee with verbal skills, with great communication, with interest. And I still remember to this day the conversation that Adele and I had, and I didn't check with Adele, but I'm sure she's okay with this, when she was interested in applying for the role that she ultimately ended up getting in my team. And I remember being in the city campus of La Trobe, and I was pacing, walking up and down along the window, talking to Adele. And I remember thinking, wow, she's great. I hope she is one of the successful people. I hope she applies. So if you get the opportunity, make the connection and do a bit of building of your personal brand. And before I move on, I just wanted to flag the Chanel one in the bottom right there, because this is another example of brand and how it sometimes can be quite disappointing. I've always loved Chanel No. 5. It's always been my perfume. And when I worked in the UK, one of our customers was Unilever, and I had to go to the Northeast into the Lake District to visit Unilever as a customer. And guess what? Unilever makes Chanel No. 5. And that just wrecked it for me, because it lost all of those kind of high brand connotations that I had loved. All the sophistication, the elegance, the Chanel connotations just became like washing powder. So brand is very important, and you do have very strong emotional connections to brand, sometimes subconsciously. Okay, so the next slide is really about feedback, and I'm being very bossy in this presentation, but again, I think it's really important, if you're not successful, to ask for feedback for two reasons. One is you will learn something, particularly if the person you're getting the feedback from is kind but honest, and that's really important. So kind, we don't want people's egos destroyed and their confidence knocked, but also very constructive. So ask questions, you'll learn from it for sure. But the other thing that you'll achieve, again, is building your brand. It's a very small industry that we work in, and almost certainly you will be coming across that person again. It's possible that person might be applying for a job with you. That happens a lot in libraries as well. You can't afford to burn any bridges. So always ask for feedback, even if it feels a bit confronting and you're putting yourself out of your comfort zone. And I think I've still got time for this. I haven't actually been looking at my watch. But from a recruiter perspective, again, I've had a fair bit of experience in this and was fortunate in previous roles where there was a lot of flexibility around this. So now that I'm in higher education, there's very little flexibility and there are lots of rules. But before I joined La Trobe, I would always take the opportunity to expose a candidate to as many different bits of the organisation as possible, and to expose as many bits of the organisation as possible to the candidate. Now, obviously, you can't do that for everybody you're interviewing, but once you get to shortlist, it's really useful. You get a lot of different perspectives from colleagues who have maybe walked somebody through the library or walked them through the building and just had a bit of a chat. And the candidate gets a really good sense of the culture of the organisation. So in a higher education environment, obviously, we're a little bit more constrained. You need to form a panel usually. And again, my approach here is to get as much diversity on the panel as is possible. And it's not always possible. We work in a pretty homogenous environment usually. But if you can get different perspectives from, say, academics or stakeholders or even students, sometimes it's quite useful to do that. And again, you give your candidate a bit more of a 360 insight into the organisation. Something I'm very conscious of, I hope, is unconscious bias. And that might sound like oxymoron. How can you be conscious of something if it's unconscious? But I think it's really important to make a conscious effort to surface that unconscious bias. And it's impossible to do it 100%, but there are little techniques. And I remember again at Caval, when we were recruiting for a marketing position, we deliberately held back the names and any personal details on the CVs of those who had applied in order to at least make the first part of the process as objective and fair as possible. And I think just by doing that, sometimes you realise where your unconscious bias lies. And the more you can challenge that, the more you can succeed in reducing the unconscious bias. And again, I've mentioned here feedback. So really important to provide feedback to an unsuccessful candidate or a successful candidate. There's always something that you can learn from this process. And we haven't really talked about anything motivational. When I was doing the research for this presentation, there's so much motivational stuff out there on the interweb. But I think this one is important, that being resilient and building resilience through the process is really vital, because you're not always going to succeed. So the more you try, the more you learn, and learning is the path to success. All of my images were from Unsplash, and that's the first time I've mucked around with images before, so that was fun. And I think questions we're leaving until the end, Sarah. Yes, Adele's nodding. So what I'll do now is hand over to my esteemed colleague, Adele, who's going to talk to you about probably some of the more useful tricks and tools of successful recruitment. Thanks, Adele.
Hello, everyone. I'm hoping we're good. So I'm going to present on practical ways you can keep your resume up to date. Now, there's lots of ways you can learn how to approach interviews and your selection criteria and things like that. If you have access to LinkedIn Learning, yay. There's lots of ways through that. That will be covered in session 3. But what I'm going to talk about is the practicalities of how you can just introduce some new habits, I guess. Yeah. So I'm going to go through this one quickly because Jay's covered that really well. A lot of people roll their eyes when they hear about what is your brand, and I totally understand why. But the thing is, you have a brand whether you are the one to create it or not. You can be known as the terminally happy person, or the person that gives really good feedback, the person who writes really good copy, the person who's a fantastic at service delivery. You already have a brand. So why wouldn't you try to curate yours a little bit more and help you get where you want to go? Or if you've already got a strong brand that you're unaware of, talk to one of your mates. What is my brand? So I think the big thing to think about with your personal brand is it's not what you do, it's the impact of what you do. It's not, this is what I do in a day. It is, this is the impact of what I've done today. And that it can be a really hard switch. But if you're really self-conscious or you find it really hard, this is where some of your workmates can come in handy. It might not be something you necessarily ask your manager, depending on your relationship with them, but it's definitely something you can ask different colleagues in the organization. If you had to describe me in 3 words, what would they be? And that can help you work out what your brand is currently and how you might like to shape it a little bit. And the thing is, developing one sentence around who you are as a professional is something that can be really, really difficult. We always talk about elevator pitches with business and projects and things. But if you had to say one sentence about what your professional persona was, what would it be? And maybe practice saying that confidently. So when you go into an interview or write your application, you already know how you're going to introduce yourself with that softball question at the beginning, which is, why do you want to work here? And you can say, well, I'm perfect because of this. And you can already speak confidently and authentically about what your value is and what you can bring to that organization. So brag book is not a term I love, but it's alliterative, so I'll go with it. We need a brag book. Something Sarah said to me just before we presented is what a colleague said to her when she started her career, document your career. And that is a bit of advice I'm going to go through with everything I talk about today. So yes, this is who you are. We'll move on. All right, brag book, what works for you? There's lots of ways you can contain this information. I have a very specific way that I've started using because I use cue cards. That's very old school. Maybe you don't do that because things can get lost. But LinkedIn is a great resource, and we'll have a presentation on that in session 3. You can record all your PD, you can record your impact of your job under each of your job descriptions. You can work on your personal brand through both the headline and the summary. There's lots of things you can do. I am working on a Google Doc because I know it's always going to be there. I used to use a folder on my desktop when I was transitioning or even Stevens with my cards. You might be someone who does a journal. You need to write things out a bit more. You might be someone who likes to use Evernote or Inkpad as an app. You might want to use voice recordings. Some people like to use a calendar. For me, I wouldn't be able to find anything ever again, but I can see why that would work for someone where a calendar is their truth. Or you might want to think about an online portfolio. So what do you collect in this brag book? So I'm going to give you homework straight away for this session. We're not going to do it in the session, but I want you to consider it immediately thereafter. So adapting to change is going to be something on all job applications, if not now, moving forward. We can all answer that question because we've had one hell of a test case, which is COVID 2020 and 2021. So you can talk about remote working, online meetings, communication, planning and timelines, organization, and leadership. They're all things you can talk about and evidence straight away. So I'd encourage you to write down a paragraph about what you've learned this year. But what I'd also love you to work on is looking through your past annual reviews, whatever they might be called in your organization, and job applications, because you have examples or the stories, as Jay mentioned, already in your belongings. You just haven't got them necessarily all together. Collate any reference and referee information. And the big piece of advice for me would be at the end of a project, write down the notes of the lessons learnt and the impact of that project. That in itself is probably the most valuable thing you can do from today's presentation, because we forget what we've achieved all the time. We might remember that awful person we worked with 10 years ago with clarity, but we'll forget 5 projects in the meantime. So you need to write that down, because that could be an example for a job in another 5 years' time that fits beautifully. And that could be both in the interview or the selection criteria. And the other thing is, what is impact? We did a good job isn't enough. You got to think about numbers. And I know we're in libraries, so a lot of it is about the word, but percentages, increases, costs saved, efficiencies developed. Also, how you dealt with a situation that went completely pear-shaped. How did you recover? What did you learn from that situation? And the one other thing I'll mention is you need to keep good records of your professional development. And that's something a lot of people don't do. There is a section on your LinkedIn where you can just add them in manually every time. And the value of the PD is particularly in your written applications, it's part of how your knowledge in working in an area. It's showing that you're committed to continuous learning. It shows that you aren't just learning on the go. You're actually listening to other people and you're applying that knowledge. The application of knowledge is really important. So you will be given all these slides and I'm going through things really fast, but I wanted to give you lots of ideas so you could find something that would work for you, because ultimately it has to be something that you will do. So my big thing in collecting examples, or what Jay called collecting stories, is I like structure. If I don't understand how things are structured, I can't figure out what goes in them. So my recommendation is to look at all the jobs you've had so far and think of the standard question or area that you get asked about in your speciality. So I'm in community engagement / programming / a little bit of communications. So there's typically questions around stakeholder management, project management, communication, organization, financial responsibility, those kinds of things. They're always going to be a question that I'm asked both in the interview and in selection criteria. So they don't change, which means I can just collect examples all the time. And then there is standard personal questions that tend to get asked. Adapting to change, collaboration, communication, flexibility sometimes. So you know some of what's going to come up. Now, if you're thinking, I want to go to the next tier within my in my profession, my big piece of advice is find a position description for a job that you're not quite ready for yet, but you would like to be in a year or two or even longer, and look at what they're asking for and add that to your list of things you want to collect stories for. And if you make this a routine, most of the work's done. And if you keep looking at this document, you will have the stories already in your brain, so you have to cram less going into a situation. But also being able to talk about this stuff will help you with your networking and definitely help you with your brand as well. It's not just all recruitment. I think it's, and I get that most people think about it as a getting job situation, but it can be bigger and more fulfilling than that. My advice is, once you've got all these areas that you know you're probably going to get asked about, think of 2 or 3 examples for each, because not every example or story fits the occasion that you're applying for. And also you use things like this not just for job applications, but you might be going for a mentorship program or a grant. All this stuff helps. So the last thing I'd recommend is, when you're working on something like this, is put a reminder in your calendar. Every month, on the last day of the month, maybe at 4 o'clock on that day, update your document or your app or your LinkedIn. So you're collecting the PD you've done for that month. If you finished your project that month, you can quickly chuck it in. It doesn't actually take long. Making it a habit will save you a lot of grief later down the line. And it also means it captures all the things that you have done incredibly well. And that's the biggest risk of not doing this regularly, is you forget more than you remember. I had this situation after being at the State Library for 9 years. I hadn't really updated any of my documentation very much in that time. So I really had to look at it with fresh eyes, and it was a lot of work, like a lot of work. So if I'd done this, not only would I have it all ready to go so I could fit things to questions in the selection criteria, but I would have been more across it in my brain for the interviews and maybe been less stressed. And I was very stressed, Jay, without the Uber incident, which I will not go into. So in terms of recording your examples, everyone talks about STAR, which is scenario, task, action, results. I actually prefer the SAO method, which is situation, action, outcome, which is actually not all that different. It's just one less thing to do. So where you did something, the context is really important. The action, what you did and how you did it, really resist the urge to make this a task list, because nothing is more boring to anyone than like all the ins and outs of what you did. You can talk about it in a bit more umbrella terms, but the outcome is really where you hit it home. Like, what was it? So I've got an example that I did for, I worked at the Centre for Youth Literature for quite a few years at the State Library. So I chose an example that's really specific. I was responsible for curation of online content. We managed accounts over Facebook, Insta, Twitter, Tumblr, and there was something else that I've forgotten. It was pre-Snapchat and TikTok. I was also responsible for the e-newsletter and a website, which was Inside a Dog. We only had a very small team, and at times it was only me. So my job was to manage all that in terms of content plan and guidelines aligned with the target goals and the strategic plan. So this is, and then these are my outcomes when I did that job over that amount of time. Newsletter went up 46%, social media grew exponentially, the website traffic went up by introducing efficient systems and data. So that took me 2 minutes to write. That's not much time. I did have to use this piece of paper that I've had for 5 years. So I did say I do like lots of paper recording, not good. So doing this presentation forced me to record this digitally, but it's really easy to get your example in there and then I won't forget it. I don't have to write everything I did. It just gives me, just triggers my memory. This is also something I'm starting to do. You can see it's not really finished, is I'm putting all, this is a Word doc in Google. Down the left-hand side, I've got different questions I have been asked or will be asked. And then I've got each of my work settings across the top, and I chuck in exactly what I did for SAO, which was the situation, the actions, and the outcomes. In some cases, you can see I've written find some outcomes because I don't remember, because I didn't record it. And that's the thing, right? I didn't have any of those stats off the top of my head, and I don't think I brought any with me either. So I might have to ask my previous manager, Anna, if there are some she can share with me, because I didn't record it at the time. But this, what you're seeing just there, took me less than 15 minutes. So it's really easy to do, and the updating it once a month could take very little time. So you've thought about doing all this, you've collated some stories. What else can you do? Well, I've talked about considering the future and looking at PDs of positions you might like to grow into, look at what they need and make that trajectory. Some organizations have EAP, some organizations don't. Some people may or may not know that EAP does career counselling, and that is looking at your resume and giving you feedback, helping you to go create selection criteria responses, giving you examples of resumes and selection criteria responses. So if you get 3 visits a year, why wouldn't you get some guidance? Like, easy peasy. And a lot of people don't know that's an option. You don't have to go there for counselling. You can go there for job finessing. My advice is, before you go, have a stab at your resume and then get the feedback and get them to walk you through it a bit instead of just leaving it till the end. Talk to recent hires in your organization. Maybe if you're really nice, if they like you, maybe you can have a look at their application. You can express interest in developing recruitment skills. So I could talk to Jay and say, if there's a job panel coming up, might you consider me to be a panelist? Because being on the other side is really, really useful, as Jay has pointed out. Participating in mentoring programs is really valuable. Jay talked about talking to colleagues about what was going on in higher ed. Sometimes you can talk to your manager, sometimes you can't. So it's always good to have different viewpoints. I had Claire Carlson as my mentor last year in the Caval program, and she was able to give me a really great overview of higher ed, and I didn't feel like I was asking like rude questions that I might ask Jay, but I probably would ask Jay anyway. But like Claire just sort of told me anything I asked, and I felt pretty unfiltered. But then again, I'm usually pretty unfiltered. So that was really fast. I went through, and I'm on time, which is exceptional. I'm sorry about the slides at the beginning. I made sure I put everything on the slides so you could refer to them later. But I would really, again, recommend that straight after this session, write down an example about the ability to react to change or stressful situations. That's something that will come up as well. You've got brilliant evidence of that. So why wouldn't you record it? I'm on Twitter as Snacky Wench. La Trobe is on Twitter as @LTU Library as well. And if you want to email me, you can. But that was how to sort of prep and develop good habits so you have less of a stroke when it's time to apply for jobs or when you're ready to fly the nest. So I'm not looking at the chat, but maybe it's time. On that note, I didn't even introduce who I was, Jay. I am the Senior Coordinator, Community Outreach and Engagement Officer at La Trobe University Library. I work both in PD, continuous improvement across La Trobe Library, and also in student engagement. So that's what I do. Okay, I guess the questions are in Slido, so let me crack that open. There are two. Wait, remember to upvote what you're interested in. Okay, we've got one question, Jay. Ideally, we want to find a workplace that is right for us. However, there is a scarcity of roles available in the library sector. Can beggars be choosers?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And yes, in the old days, I guess we could, and possibly now not so much. But I still believe that finding a good fit for yourself is the best possible outcome, and ending up somewhere that isn't a good fit can just be very detrimental to confidence, self-esteem, energy, mental health, all kinds of things. So I guess finding a balance between the ideal fit and what can be made to work is probably a more practical approach for today's environment.
Yeah.
Adele, do you want to add anything to that?
I mean, a new job is a new opportunity, even if it's not a great circumstance. If you can make the best out of a situation, then I guess that's great. But yeah, you have to make decisions that are best for you. And sometimes those decisions are financial, and no one's going to judge you for that after the year we've just had. So I think, yeah, I think do what works for you and don't feel judged by it, basically. But like, I had not had a great manager previously, so I was really careful when I was checking out the job at La Trobe to suss out Jay that she would be someone I would want to work under and I could have a good relationship with, and that's been really evident because I was a little burnt from previous situation, and that was a priority for me in a job that I went into. I wanted to be in a workplace that had a good vibes, and I wanted to be in a workplace with a manager who supported me and I would be happy to support, and I got that. So but yeah, sometimes financial is what you need to prioritize on, and that's absolutely fine.
Can I just add to what Adele just said, because that is quite important, that most people leave a job because of their relationship with their direct manager. And most people stay in a job, even if it's not ideal, because of their relationship with their direct manager. So maybe that's the best piece of guidance for now.
Yeah. We might go on to the next question. Would a lack of social media presence be detrimental to being hired?
I say no. I say no social media presence is better than bad social media presence. And all it indicates is that somebody is choosy about the platforms that they engage with. And I think that probably applies to everybody that I work with. Some are active on some platforms and carefully so, and not active on others for very carefully thought out reasons.
You should never be on a platform that you don't like. It will end in tears. So it's not good for you, and it's not good for the people that would be reading your content. A lot of people right now are rushing to TikTok. I would say that's a lot of work. Do you want to be there? I think you can't not have a LinkedIn profile, and I would recommend spending some time getting that up to date. You do need somewhere online where people can find out about you. The great thing about LinkedIn is you can control that. You can put exactly what you want up there, to the, basic or to a very over, like you could go really, really hard, but you do need a place where people can go if they're curious about you in a good way. So that would be my piece of advice there.
And just to follow on from that again, Adele, I think as a recruiter, if you don't check social media, you are being remiss. I think you always need to have a look and see what kind of presence does a potential candidate employee have in the public domain, because people have a responsibility to present themselves in a way that makes that attractive to potential employers. And if they don't, you need to know that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, if Jay knew how much I talk about greyhounds, I might not have got the job because Maggie was an after job acquisition. Maggie is my greyhound. What are some questions you've asked diplomatically to scope out potential employers?
Employers, not employees.
Yes. Well, a question I've seen online a bit is, how would you, I guess you could ask this of someone else to find out about. So if I wanted to find out about Jay, I could ask someone else who I knew were in the same area. I could ask, what would Jay do to help me thrive? What is Jay? Finding out a way a manager communicates is super important. And that's, for some people, it's a note, like verbally for me is a thing. I need to talk through things. Luckily, Jay also likes to talk through things. But some managers and can be very much about just emails and things like that. I think finding out if an organization has gone through a restructure recently, which I can assume pretty much everybody has or is right now, is probably not a good question. I would find out what their retention rate is if you can. That's a question you can ask. So what kind of turnover have you had in the last 3 to 5 years? I think good is 20%, Jay. It's not on the top of my head, but if there's no turnover, that means no one's leaving, which isn't necessarily a good thing. And then if there's a huge amount of turnover, that's not a good thing either. So finding out what the turnover rate of employees is a good cultural hint. Trying to think of anything else.
So a question I would often try and come at in different ways is how much influence will I have as a potential employee? So I think to work in an organization that really responds and listens and gives people opportunity to develop and make mistakes, that's really important. How you ask that question is tricky, because if you come back with a yes or no answer, that's not really going to allow that conversation to develop. So coming at a question like that sort of obliquely is probably the best way to get honest responses. And I think it's often a good idea not to put yourself as the sort of central protagonist, but to talk about somebody else in the organization, a hypothetical person. If they did this, what might be the outcome of that? So you're not putting words in, you're not assigning emotional kind of baggage to a yes or no answer, but you're just genuinely asking an open hypothetical question about opportunities to be influential and to be supported to develop through the organisation. So it's often about the questioning skill. You want to get at the information, but you need to do that without being too confrontational about it.
I mean, you can always ask them to describe the culture, and if they just say the stock standard buzzwords, then probably, might need to push a little harder maybe, or that might tell you that it's maybe not good and they're just using the the go-to, but I think talking to someone who would be managing you pre even writing the selection criteria is really important, because that's a good match of if you want to work there or if you think you can get along, or asking a manager, like, how would you best like to communicate, or how would you describe your management style, is really, really good about how it will mix with your own, because there's no good or bad styles. It's just like how you can work together, because, you know, there's always two people. Christy, I do a lot of PD. So do I. Adele, do you think there's a point where you want to collate types of PD rather than listing individual occasions? Yes. If you're doing a lot of PD, I do a lot online. I do certifications on the side. So I sort of list all the more serious or longer, the ones where I spent more time. If I spent an hour doing it, it's not going to be something I mention in selection criteria, but I've been doing design user experience in libraries certification, so I would mention that, because that's 6 courses. So yes. What do you think about thank you emails after the interview, Jay? Would a thank you email influence your decision to hire someone? I didn't send one.
No to the second one, and it's fine to the first one, but it's not important. I think it's not important at all. It's nice to get, but it would certainly not influence my decision. But how somebody responds to being declined or rejected or not successful is very important. And you would definitely remember that conversation next time you are hiring. I also want to respond to Louise's question in the chat. So, because I think this is an important one. So in a situation where you have left a previous workplace due to its culture or manager, what is the best way to answer, why did you leave your last role, in an interview? And I think, Louise, you probably already know the answer to this. Obviously, the wrong answer is, it was toxic, he was a bastard, I had to go. Having said that, you do need to be somehow authentic. And I think it might be best to frame it as, it was a learning opportunity. I realized it wasn't a great fit. What I'm looking for in a manager in a workplace is X, Y, Z. So it's being constructive, because in our industry, you really cannot burn bridges and you cannot badmouth people in any industry. You can't. It reflects very poorly on you as an individual. So I'm sure we've all been in that situation. That's how I would approach it. But anybody else who wants to contribute to that, please jump in. Adele.
I think I was focusing on what I wanted to grow, and under that person, that was really, really difficult. So I could talk about what my desires were as my career progressed, and I wanted to learn more, and I wanted to work under someone who wanted to collaborate with me. And I sort of just focused on that from what I remember. I think I went blank for most of my interview, but that's also true. So yes. Okay, for Adele or Jay, do you have an example of how some unconscious bias on the interviewer's part may have worked against you? I have an example. I went for an internal job at a previous organization, and I don't know if it was unconscious, but they thought they knew me already. So I could tell they weren't really listening to my examples, and that was quite frustrating. So yeah, that was difficult. And that's the risk of being at an organization a long time, is they see you as you started as opposed to where you were at that moment.
So that might lead to a tip for recruiters, is that when you're in a situation that you are interviewing somebody you know, which I'm sure, again, we all are, it's really important to just try and be completely objective about that person, to approach it as if you have never met them before. And as the interviewee, remember that that is likely to be the position that the interviewer is in too. And I think I saw this a lot when we interviewed internally at La Trobe, that people who expected to ride on their previous success without really having to talk about it were not always successful. Whereas people who thought about it freshly as, right, I need to persuade these people, and again, that I'm the right person for the job, as if they know nothing, that is definitely the right way to approach an internal interview. So there's a responsibility on the part of the interviewer or the panel as well as the interviewee, to approach it with completely fresh eyes.
I'm so sorry, we're actually out of questions, and there was one there that would probably take 10 minutes to answer properly about representation in leadership positions, which we all know is a problem. Hope maybe Jay and I could answer some of these together tomorrow, and we could put them, like we could hashtag them and put them on the La Trobe Library Twitter maybe. Just there's a few more questions left, so we'll try to tackle them later. But thank you very much, Jay, for sharing all your expertise, and thank you for the very lively chat. I believe we're handing over to Adrian.
Thank you, Adele. And look, thanks very much, both Jay and Adele, for really a very insightful presentations and tips, and the way you shared your experiences so openly. And I'd also like to thank everyone who asked questions and also added to that very rich chat stream that just went on non-stop through the session. In terms of thanking our presenters today, thanking Jay and Adele, we're going to continue the initiative we started in 2020, which was to arrange for native trees to be planted through the organisation 115 Trees. So that will be our thank you, instead of a virtual bottle of wine or any equivalent. And look, I'd also like to thank Marion Slawson, the chair of PDIG, for helping get us together to organise this, all the committee members who contributed, and also Sarah herself, who's really the glue who holds us together, I think, through this. Now, if you've got any further questions, as Adele said, you can send them through to members@cavell.edu.au, and they can go on to Adele and Jay. And finally, a reminder about our next webinar, which is to be held on Thursday, 25th of March, 11 a.m. to 12:30 in Australian Eastern Time. Now, at this one, we'll have staff from LinkedIn Learning, and they're going to be telling us about how to grow and improve our online identities and presence and develop our online networks. So I look forward to seeing you, as many of you as possible, on the Thursday. And thank you very much for your contribution today.